there are still going to be calls for help from the Holy Land. OK, maybe if Jerusalem hadn't fallen, this Saladin is still dangerous. And so there is a need, perhaps, for a new crusade, as they'd asked in 1185 with the Patriarch coming to London. So he could well have responded to that. I don't think that's a ridiculous suggestion.
I mean, the key thing about Hattin is that the Crusading kingdom is no longer capable of offensive action after that.
It's not capable of defensive action.
The Battle of Hattin, a decisive conflict during the Crusades, unfolded on July the 4th, 1187. It happened at the crossroads of three continents, in some of the most fought-over terrain in history, near the Horns of Hattin in modern-day Israel. This monumental engagement marked a decisive turning point in the struggle between the Crusader states and the Muslim forces of the Ayyubid Sultanate Saladin. The brilliant Muslim commander strategically lured the Frankish army into an arid region far from water sources, capitalizing on the scorching summer heat to weaken his foes. The Crusaders, led by Guy of Lusignan, were decisively defeated, with their forces devastated and many high-ranking nobles captured. This victory opened the path for Saladin's subsequent conquest of Jerusalem, shifting the balance of power in the Holy Land and sparking the Third Crusade. The Battle of Hattin stands as a testament to strategy, resilience, and the far-reaching consequences of medieval warfare. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Hattin, the clash that shattered Crusader dominance in the Holy Land. But what if the tides had turned in the other direction? What if King Guy outmaneuvered Saladin, broke the encirclement and crushed the Ayyubid forces? Well, that's a question for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry, and for the first time on the show, we're delighted to be joined by Jonathan Phillips, a professor of the history of the Crusades at Royal Holloway University. Welcome to you both. Let's begin with the first map we have in front of us. This shows the Levant as it would have been in 1187, and a few key things to point out first of all. Hattin itself, the Horns of Hattin, which give their name to the battle, you can see here in modern-day Israel. Then you've got Tiberias, of course, which Saladin had laid siege to. We'll come on and talk a lot about that over the course of this discussion. And Tiberias, of course, is on the banks of Lake Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. Also, it's worth pointing out what is known as Acre, very significant location in the context of the Levant in the 12th century. Also, of course, down here on the map, we have Jerusalem, the centre point of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, absolutely fundamental to what the Crusaders were fighting over. And, of course, it is Jerusalem that falls a few months after the Battle of Hattin. Where is Saladin at this point? Well, a couple of things to point out. First of all, he's got control of the Caliphate of Cairo, which is marked in green on this map, and also the Emirate of Damascus as well. Jonathan Phillips, welcome to History Undone, first of all. Sum up, if you can, what has happened really from the end of the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century through to now. What is the lie of the land in the Levant?
1099, the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, and the Muslim world, understandably, given it was the First Crusade, didn't really know what had hit it. It has no real idea that this is a war of religious settlement, religious colonisation, if you like. And also, the Muslim world at this time, the Muslim Near East, is very divided. The First Crusade turns up at the right moment, by accident, I think. You've got the basic division in Islam between the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Sunnis largely, you would say, are Syria and Iraq, and the Shiites are in Egypt. And then also there's been a political fragmentation. There's a great line from a poet who says 1094 was the year of the death of caliphs and commanders. And so many senior figures in Egypt and in Syria had died that year. There's a lack of leadership. And the First Crusade exploits that fragmentation. It's not facing a sort of stronger foe. And that enables it to set up what we call the four Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa further inland. And they settle down and become part of, if you like, the sort of fabric of the Near East. They fight each other sometimes. They sometimes ally with Muslims against other Christians and other Muslims. So it kind of settles down. But as the 12th century goes on, there's a change. and the Muslim counter-crusade, the anti-Frankish jihad, as we should probably better call it, begins to gather momentum. There's a man called Nur al-Din, who we all know about Saladin, but Nur al-Din is the man who really does the hard work, actually, in my view. And he draws together the religious classes and the noble classes. And that's the crucial ingredient that gives the counter-crusade a sort of sharp edge and, if you like, an intellectual edge. And he's a good warrior, and he starts putting a lot of pressure on the Franks, as they're called, on the Crusader states. So that really is if you like, the context for then the rise of Saladin, because in the 1160s, Egypt is the big battleground. Nur al-Din and the King of Jerusalem are trying to get hold of Egypt, which is rather weak at the time, and Nur al-Din manages to do it through his proxies, amongst whom emerges Saladin. So that really is, if you like, the setup.
Well, Dr. Chris Parry, do you want to pick up the story and tell us a little bit about Saladin and the coalition that he's assembling at this point?
Yes, the key issue is to be able to exert pressure on the crusading states from a number of directions. And the key decisive achievement of Saladin is to be able to unite authority over what is happening in Egypt with what is happening in Damascus. The Crusaders have already lost Edessa in the 1140s under pressure from Nur ad-Din and the others. So you're constantly under attack from one end of the states to the other. And there's a whole series of battles throughout the 12th century where the Crusaders lose quite a lot of people. They're feeding manpower in, but they're losing quite a lot. And the thing goes back and forward. And as Jonathan says, you know, they ally with each other. They ally with the local Muslim leaders, depending on what they need to do. Now, one thing that everybody ignores here, you mentioned in the introduction, it is at the junction of 3 continents, but it's a huge trading area as well, not only by sea. These seaports are very, very prosperous. Italian city-states are actually involved there. There's also passing traffic from Damascus to Egypt and further down into Arabia. Now, these are exploitable for tolls and also protection money. So you get castles like Karak in Moab here, which are used by some of the leaders to actually exert control. It is literally, you know, an extortion racket. And what also happens is you get a series of raids. Now, you get local Muslim leaders and indeed some of the more prominent figures conducting raids into these territories. There are counter raids as well. For example, there's a battle under Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, at Banyas in the north. And essentially, he's basically trying to interrupt the sheep trade that goes from Damascus to the north here. So it's a constant search for resources on both sides and part of the pattern of what is going on here in the Middle East. And Saladin's key achievement is, as I said, being able to unite the resources of Egypt with Damascus, and towards the end of the 1170s, that of Aleppo as well, in the north of Syria. And what he's put together is essentially a coalition. And he explicitly says, you know, this is a jihad. We're going to go holy war against the Christian states that are to the west of us. But he spends most of his time trying to knit this coalition together and bring people to heel. So all the time he's trying to probe the defences and trying to see where he can actually defeat the Christian kingdom and counties. He's watching his back. Because if he fails, there's all sorts of other people prepared to take advantage of the situation, take over power and things like that.
And Jonathan, if we look at the leadership of the Crusader states, I mean, there are 2 key figures we're going to talk about a lot, Raymond of Tripoli and then Guy of Lusignan. So who are they?
Guy of Lusignan is a man who's relatively recently arrived in the Crusader states. He's from a French noble family with crusading traditions, and his brother is sort of quite well established in the kingdom, and he moves into the realms of the higher nobility. He's important because he ends up marrying Sibylla, who is the heiress to the throne of Jerusalem. So that's really his way in. But he's got, if you like, sort of rather shallow, relatively shallow roots in the Holy Land. Raymond of Tripoli is one of the great nobles of the Holy Land. The Counts of Tripoli are well established. He's a man who's been a prisoner of the Muslims for a long time in the 1160s. He's very much an establishment figure. He's a highly capable ruler of Tripoli, and people regard him as a pretty kind of impressive figure.
And Chris, I suppose that the key thing here, by the time you get to 1187, Saladin senses he's got an opportunity now, that he senses that the Crusader states of the Levant are weakened, maybe a little bit divided, and he's got an opportunity maybe to make a move that eventually could lead to the fall of Jerusalem.
We shouldn't underestimate the resources at his disposal if he can bring it all together. But that depends on local situation, the resources he can bring in any particular time, the incentives that he can offer some of these local emirs. And you can't always bring that together. The key figure, oddly enough, in the Saladin story is King Baldwin IV. Now, he's only 13 when he comes to the throne in the 1170s, and he's got leprosy. Despite that, he's actually quite a decent military commander. He defeats Saladin at Montgizard down in the south of the States quite heavily. It's an outnumbered Crusader army. In fact, Raymond in Tripoli is up in the north with a very large Crusading army attacking Harim here, while he goes down south and deals with Saladin. And Saladin is nearly captured. He only gets away on a racing camel. So it's quite famously so. And oddly enough, Montgizard sticks in Saladin's mind as something he has to avenge. Now, all the while, Baldwin IV is suffering from leprosy. He has to actually have regents operating for him. And initially, it's a chap called Reynaud of Chatillon, who is a buccaneering figure. I think it's probably the nicest thing you could say about him. He is successively married to various heiresses, and he picks up fiefdoms in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But he ends up at Kerak in Moab here. This is a famous castle. It still exists today. And he uses that to raid Muslim traffic. And he's not particular about when he does it. That's the trouble. But he's also regent for Baldwin IV. And as part of that, he takes command of the army. And in several engagements, he's quite cautious in not risking the army of the kingdom. Later on, Raymond of Tripoli is also regent. And again, it's a very cautious approach. And if you look at the way the kingdom operates, it has to maintain a field army to give confidence to the various fortresses that exist on the borders that they will be relieved if they're taken under siege by the Muslims. But at no stage throughout the 1170s and 80s do they commit the full force of the crusading kingdoms to actually relieve any fortress. It's always a very cautious policy, whether it's Raymond of Tripoli or whether it's Reynaud of Chatillon or indeed Guy of Lusignan. Guy of Lusignan himself is regent in 1183, and we'll come on later and perhaps compare his approach in 1183 with what it is in 1187. Yeah. Because after he is very cautious in 1183 in not being drawn into Saladin's trap, a battle called La Foule. It takes place over a week. He's heavily criticised for having the largest crusading army within living memory and not attacking Saladin.
And that's a key point. And I suppose, just before we move on to the events of the battle itself, just reflect on that a moment, Jonathan, because that is really crucial context here.
It is. In a sense, Guy has just become regent, and so he's almost got to prove himself. And they've taxed everybody heavily. I said, suddenly we need the money. And this is an opportunity with the biggest army they've gathered for many decades to attack Saladin, who at that time has not got the sort of all the cities that he wants under his control. So he's potentially not at his full strength. And Guy, with the benefit of hindsight, takes a more prudent decision. He's like a boxer who just sort of stays out of range the whole time. He shadows Saladin. He makes sure that he doesn't want to engage in a battle. If he's going to besiege somewhere, then the Crusaders have got the control of water and supply lines. So he makes it difficult. And Saladin ravages the land, gets some prisoners, gets some cattle, and has to go away. So in one way, you could say, yeah, he hasn't risked it. He hasn't put the field army in jeopardy. Everywhere, all the big castles and towns are still secure. But on the other hand, people are unhappy at having that loss of land and territory. But it's a sense of, is it short-term game or a longer-term game? But when you throw in the politics of it and the fact that Guy is relatively new, he's unpopular, then he's open to criticism. Why didn't you fight? Come on, this was your big chance. You know, you had to show yourself.
And this is an issue of honour as well.
Yeah, which is a big driver. in the medieval period. We're sort of the age of chivalry is coming on strong. The notion of honour, of bravery, and the notion of dishonour and cowardice are a big part of this, and we'll see more of that as we go through the story.
The interesting thing is that what we're talking about is a campaign that takes place here in the Jezreel Valley, which is in the vicinity of the area south of Lake Tiberias. So essentially, Saladin and Guy are actually operating in much the same region as they will for the Hattin campaign. Baldwin IV himself is also tempted to attack Saladin in the vicinity of Beaver here, Belvoir. And he resists the temptation to be drawn on to where Saladin is. So it's a really well-established campaign that you stay close to your watering holes, you don't get drawn into territory that is not good for you, and you don't get isolated from your lines of communication. And the one thing that commanders in this particular part of the world have to be good at is looking at the geography and saying, how can I exploit this to my advantage? Not only the watering holes, but the hills and valleys, and also how the cultivated land is actually made up. And this is an area that is really, really marched and fought over. And as Jonathan has pointed out in his own books, it's probably the least defended part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And why it's never fortified is because to the east here, you've got this very arid region that leads you to Hattin and Lake Tiberias.
And Jonathan, another thing we do have to stress, of course, is the significance of Jerusalem here.
Yeah, absolutely. The most important place for Christians, a place of Christ's tomb, Christ's life. And so, therefore, you have the focus of the Christian faith, but also the third most important site for Muslims, behind Mecca and Medina. Jerusalem is the place where the Prophet ascended to heaven on his night journey. So that is part of the justification, or it's the main part of the justification for Nur al-Din and then Saladin to say, this is our city. We need it back for our people, for our faith.
And Chris, just before we focus on the events of the battle itself, one other thing to mention about the politics, particularly around Guy.
Baldwin IV dies of leprosy in the end, and essentially the kingdom passes to Sibylla, his sister, who has an infant son called Baldwin, the fifth. He dies, and the lords of the kingdom say, look, we've got a lot of these Johnny-come-latelys like Reynaud of Chatillon and Guy of Lusignan. We don't really like Guy, you know, he didn't do very well militarily, and we'd like you to divorce him because we don't want him as king consort. And she says, OK, we'll do that. As long as I can choose who I marry afterwards. Now, Raymond of Tripoli wants the Pope to decide who the King of Jerusalem is going to be. And they agree in the end that Sibylla can choose her husband, and they divorce. And she says, well, actually, I want to marry Guy of Lusignan. And of course, she marries him and he becomes king alongside her. And so you've got this real tension between Raymond of Tripoli and the old guard, if you like, and the newcomers, typified by Reynaud of Chatillon and indeed Guy of Lusignan. There's one other power in the area that we need to consider here, and it's a counterbalancing power. It's actually the Emperor of Byzantium here, who frequently makes sort of interventions here. But at this point, it is standing very much clear of it all.
Well, listen, that is fascinating context. That was the lie of the land in the Levant in 1187. Let's focus in now on the events of the Battle of Hattin itself. OK, so we've got another map in front of us now showing the key movements of the Crusader and Ayyubid forces leading up to the Battle of Hattin. Before we get into the events of the battle, let's just review some of the key statistics here. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, mustered approximately 20,000 men, including around 1,200 knights and 15,000 infantry. The Ayyubid forces under Saladin numbered about 30,000 troops, including a large contingent of cavalry. The battle resulted in a decisive victory for Saladin. Crusader losses were catastrophic. Nearly the entire army was killed or captured, with an estimated 17,000 dead, and the surviving knights, including Guy, taken prisoner. Saladin's forces suffered fewer casualties at around 3,000, although it is worth saying exact numbers do remain unclear. And the engagement culminated in the capture of the True Cross, a critical blow to Crusader morale. The symbolism of the One True Cross was very significant, and it paved the way for Saladin's subsequent conquest of Jerusalem and much of the Crusader-held territory. OK, Jonathan and Chris, we're looking at this map now of the key area, really, of the battle around the Horns of Hattin, which give their name to the conflict. Jonathan, to start with you, why has Saladin chosen this moment to make his move?
Saladin chose this moment to really launch his invasion because he's finally got all the pieces on the board together that he needs. He's seen in these earlier attacks that he maybe hasn't got the strength to break the Christians, to break the Crusaders. But in 1186, he got hold of Mosul. So now he's got the key cities of Mosul, Aleppo, Damascus and Egypt at his disposal. This really gives him the resources. Also, it means other people aren't picking away at him behind his back to launch this invasion. And so, while there is a truce, there is, in a sense, fortunately for him, Reynold of Chatillon breaks it by attacking a trade caravan that's running through down near Kerak. So that gives him an excuse to invade, which he very gratefully takes. And so he draws all his forces together. And interestingly, in late June, sort of somewhere over here, he conducts what you might call a sort of an inspection, a parade. So he really gets everybody together. You're going to go here, you're going to go here. He moves amongst the people, encouraging them, giving out gifts. There's religious leaders as well. So he's really saying this is the moment. But he's also aware that people behind his back are saying, no, you spend too much time fighting Muslims. It's about time that you really got going on this. So and he wants to. You know, let's be clear. Saladin is a pious man. He wants to recover Jerusalem for his faith as well. So this is the moment. He's got everything lined up.
And Chris, he makes his move on Tiberias, on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias. Why does he go for Tiberias, and how does he do it?
Well, it's the one fortified element on this side of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias. It actually is the home at the time of the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, Esquiva de Bures. And they basically besiege the city of Tiberias. They take the city, but they don't take the citadel. The Franks who are there with Lady Esquiva, they stay in the citadel. And they say, look, we are a fortress that has come under siege by the Muslims. Come and help us. And King Guy, with the military orders and probably the biggest army that they've been able to get together probably in the last 80 years, starts off from Acre and picks up other troops on the way. They're joined by Raymond of Tripoli and Balian of Ibelin, another major lord of the region. And together, as I said, they've probably got the biggest army that they've put together in some time. Now, there are sort of real sort of discussions about how they're going to approach this. And as we'll see, as they approach the sort of what they call the pools of Sephoria, which is a major centre point for crusading armies that are combating anything coming from the east here. And you see this being a sort of junction point for almost everything the Crusaders put together in the middle part of the kingdom here when they're trying to keep the Muslims away. So they head for Sephoria. It's well watered, it's well defended, and of course they know the region. And the valley here, called the Jezreel Valley, it's quite fertile, so they can live off the supplies there as well. The key point is it's the end of June, beginning of July.
It's very arid, not a lot of water, very hot.
And searing heat. Now, searing heat is quite extraordinary, and those who've visited the region at this time will know that you can't touch metal at this point. And if you're an armoured knight, that's a bit of a problem.
That's an issue,
But you need water. So staying close to your water is pretty important, but also you've got water here. So if you can make it to Lake Tiberias, then you not only relieve the city and the citadel, but also you've got lots of water here as well. So there's a bit of an incentive for pushing forward in that sense. But in the past, the experience that all these commanders have had is you stay here, you wait for the Muslims or Saladin to make his move, see which area he's going to branch out into. And we've got to remember the Muslims are raiding at this point into the local area, so they're actually destroying resources, they're actually provoking the locals into it. Now, one other thing is critical here. The master of the temple, a chap called Gerard de Riedfort, he's only been in the kingdom since 1180, and he's had a meteoric rise to the top of the Templars in that time. has previously engaged in combat at a battle called Cresson, which in the past has been thought to be near Nazareth, but maybe closer to Caesarea. He got a good hiding, and he is looking to actually make up for that.
It's a battle that's so brutal. The Crusaders, so many of them are killed. There's a small number, about 140 knights, and the Master of the Temple and there's about 7,000 Muslims. And the Master of the Temple says, we have to attack. It would be a disgrace, a dishonour if we didn't. It's obviously foolish. And even though it's his idea, he gets away with it. He's one of the 3 people who escape. And in fact, it's a battle so terrible, a Muslim writer says, it would turn black hair to grey.
Wow.
It's that grim an event. But there you get these seeds of Gerard's aggression. In a sense, part of the ethos of the Knights Templar, a group founded on the basis of defending the Holy Land, if you like, the sworn enemies of Islam. They're well-armed, they're well-trained. That's a great part of their ethos. And Gerard is really there sort of carrying it through to an ultimate expression. So that's part of the background you've got kicking around.
And Jonathan, with the siege of Tiberias, there is a debate, is there not, between Guy of Lusignan and Raymond of Tripoli as to whether it is worth going to try and relieve it. And actually, interestingly, despite the fact that it's Raymond's wife who is there under siege, it's Raymond who's saying, actually, we don't need to go and relieve it.
You've got to say, in a sense, Saladin, he's been trying to provoke the Crusaders for years. And, you know, what can I do to draw them out? They're just not biting. And you've got to, in a sense, give him credit for picking Tiberias. He knows the politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, for sure. Where it's Raymond of Tripoli, who has even been in a truce with Saladin recently. They're that bitterly divided on the Crusader side, to pick on that place where his wife is. And so, you know, Saladin has set a very clever trap. And the arguments go, really, you know, should we attack Saladin or should we not? And it's Raymond who says, look, even though I have the most to lose here, it's my wife, it's my citadel, I think, you know, we should let it fall because we cannot risk the security of the kingdom in this. And everybody decides that, yeah, that's probably a good idea. But then Gerard de Riedfort, in a scene that it's quite sort of good to conjure up in one's mind, a sort of, I mean, it sounds like a movie almost, sort of late night in the tent, and you've got the king, and Gerard goes to him and said, the last time Raymond of Tripoli told you not to fight, what happened? You got removed from the regency, and here he is telling you again not to fight. You've only just become king. This is your really big chance to kind of, you know, show yourself as a great leader. You're almost sort of saying, like, you've got to man up here. And also, there's lots of other agendas because Gerard is aggressive. He wants to avenge what happened at Cresson. He dislikes Raymond personally. And in the end, he swings Guy's mind. And so the following morning, the order is given to march. And everybody go, hang on, I thought we were staying here. And Guy just says, if I say we want to march, we march.
I mean, it's really interesting, the business with Gerard de Riedfort and Raymond of Tripoli. There's a couple of things that come in here. When Gerard originally arrives, he's promised an heiress. And Raymond of Tripoli actually gives the heiress away to one of the Italian nobles on the coast.
For her weight in gold.
Supposedly for her weight in gold, absolutely. Yeah, it's a famous story. But in fact, this is a festering sore. So instead of actually marrying this heiress at Botron, I think was the fiefdom, he then becomes a member of the Templars, and as I said, has a meteoric rise. I mean, up to Grand Master by the time of Hattin. Now, as Jonathan mentioned, the Cresson battle occurred at a time when Raymond of Tripoli had a truce with Saladin, and Saladin's troops were actually allowed to cross Raymond of Tripoli's land to actually get at where the pools of Cresson were. And this is where Gerard of Riedfort commits his fanatical sort of monk soldiers, his Templars, to this sort of massacre. So you can see the festering sore that is going on within the Christian tent here.
But I would repeat, you know, Saladin knows this stuff is happening. Yeah. And so I think Tiberias is a very astute choice. I mean, you might say, you know, we've been talking about personalities, really, haven't we? As much as sort of grand strategy. But you've got to, you know, put the pressure on those personalities to make the mistakes.
And was Saladin's strategy always, we don't want to fight them at Tiberias, we want to draw them out, we want to have a battle somewhere else, and hence why you end up with the engagement at the Horns of Hattin?
He wants a battle somewhere. I doubt whether he chose Hattin specifically, but somewhere in the region, you know, through here, maybe possibly in the coast of Acre, something like that. But yeah, he needs a battle. That's just it.
But actually, as it happens, this is an incredibly arid region. And in fact, in previous battles, Raymond of Tripoli and others have said, look, we're not going to fight in this area here because it's not great for our cavalry. It's not great because we can't actually water the horses and we can't actually charge over some of this ground. And if you go there, you can see it's not great cavalry country.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to actually fight. When I say cavalry country, it's okay if you're light cavalry, but if you're heavy cavalry, it's not great. So you know, whether he wants to fight here or not, the Christians actually are led to water, if you like, very, very easily.
And when the engagement comes on the 4th of July, Saladin has the high ground.
Well, it says it started on the 3rd of July. The sort of attempt to relieve Tiberias starts on the morning of the 3rd of July. It's just over sort of 30 kilometres. So if you've got 14 hours of daylight, you know, it's about 2 kilometres an hour, which sounds very, very slow. But the things that slow the Christian army down are the fact that many of them are foot soldiers. They're just recruits from the villages and the farms. They're not professional soldiers. So in a sense, they're finding it difficult. They're being attacked by the Muslims the whole time. Saladin's light cavalry charge up, fire the arrows and just wheel away before you can really pin them down. So there's that. There's the heat and the lack of water. And this, again, is where Saladin's got his preparations right. He can bring up water from Lake Tiberias really easily. He's got absolute, almost literally bucket loads of the stuff. And so he's never going to be running out of water. On this march, there's some springs at Turan, and there's 1 or 2 other tiny seasonal pools. And we're in early July. They're just empty. And if you've got an army of 20,000 going across that with the horses that need, 27 litres of water a day, you are going to struggle. So even that 2 kilometres an hour target is just not attainable. And so Saladin is basically escorting this army that's going like a big train, going sort of slower and slower and slower. And in the end, they have to camp for the night on the 3rd of July. Saladin doesn't let them sleep. There's drums, there's trumpets. And then when they set out again early on the 4th of July, the wind comes from the west and he sets fire to some of the dry land. I mean, having been there, it's absolutely sort of bone dry. It's so brittle. And so when you've got that west wind blowing that into the mouths of these parched, warriors, farmers, townspeople, it really is ramping up the suffering.
I think it's worth mentioning that when they set out, the crusading army does what it normally does. It keeps the knights in the middle, and it has the infantry very close packed. You've got spearmen, lancers, men-at-arms, but also archers as well. And on the first day, they actually do quite well. They keep the Muslim light horse away. But what Saladin has done is provided 400 cartloads of arrows. This is one thing he's learnt from previous engagements. OK, I need lots of arrows because I've run out in the past. But actually on the first day, the formation's not bad. And what the Christians do is do what they always do when they're successful. They allow the knights to charge and keep people at range. And that's what goes on throughout the first day, is the knights emerge from within the infantry, attack the Muslims and keep them away. And so for the first day, the Christian army is doing exactly what it normally does when it's successful.
Albeit very slow. It's slowing down. And Saladin's got his troops to come around behind them and to the north of them as well. So they're sort of being escorted, if you like, towards the east.
I mean, the key thing is that they originally wanted to go to the south here. And because of the need for water, they actually get pushed, as Jonathan says, by the Muslims up to here. And, of course, it doesn't actually suffice. And then, of course, they camp and overnight they have to make a decision. Do we go back or do we go forward?
Well, let's talk about the events of the 4th of July and really talk me through how Saladin wins this battle.
The Crusader army has to set out early morning. I suppose the sun must be in their eyes as well, making it even harder. They barely slept. Saladin's troops have got all this water. Apparently they could even pour buckets out in front of the Franks just to show how much they had and how much the Franks did not. And really the discipline amongst the infantry is breaking down badly. A big group of the mounted knights under Raymond of Tripoli charge at the Muslims. And Saladin's nephew, very wisely, just opens up and lets them come through because they're going downhill. So this group of mounted knights are coming towards you. Do you want to take the hit? No. Open up, let them go through, they're not going to go down to the bottom of the hill, turn around and come back up in this heat. So that's how Raymond of Tripoli escapes. And in a sense, it barely costs the Muslims anything. So really, as the day goes on, the Crusaders are being worn down. And then the infantry see this feature, the Horns of Hattin, which is an old volcano with the lip of it's broken. So that's why it looks like two horns. And it's up an incline, and they basically pick there to make their last stand. It's an old Iron Age fort. They can use a little bit of it, as almost as a defensive feature. But there, the infantry and the remaining cavalry, maybe about 150 of them, are there. The king's red tent is pitched. They've got the relic of the true cross, the relic of the cross upon which Christ was crucified, and that's really where they try to make a last stand. They make two attempts to pile down the hill to get to Saladin himself. If you kill the leader, as in the Battle of Hastings, then things change dramatically, and they come pretty close.
Twice.
Yeah.
Twice.
Yeah. There's a nice story that one of the chroniclers is told by Saladin's son, who was next to him. And he's basically saying, look, we've won. And Saladin is sort of, no, we haven't. And he's tugging his beard. It's the only way we know Saladin has a beard. And this happens, and they push the Crusader knights back, and his son says, we've won. He goes, no, we haven't yet. They push them back a second time, and then they see the red tent fall, the king's tent, and they go, OK, we have now succeeded.
And in the end, Saladin encircles the Crusader forces, does he not? Well,
yeah, exactly that. In fact, it's quite interesting. Raymond of Tripoli gets away. He was leading the vanguard, the main force by Guy himself. But Balian of Ibelin, who's had the rear guard, he gets away as well from this battle. So essentially, people see the writing on the wall, and as you say, Saladin and his troops encircle them, and Guy says, OK, I think we've had enough.
And he's taken prisoner.
Yeah, he's taken prisoner, so is Reynaud of Chatillon and Gerard of Riefort as well, along with the surviving Templars. Now, the people you need to feel sorry for here are the Hospitallers, because the other military orders said, we don't need to fight this battle, we'd like to stay behind as well. So they were on the side of staying well back at Sepharia, but they get involved as well. But you've got about 200 of the military orders get captured, and the story goes that Guy was taken to Saladin, and Saladin gave him basically some chilled water to drink. And Guy gives the cup to Reynaud of Chatillon, and depending on who you believe, it was dashed from his hands, because Saladin says, I don't offer you protection by giving you hospitality. And Reynaud of Chatillon, because of what has happened before, is taken outside and killed on the spot. Some people say by Saladin personally. And of course, at this point, Guy is going, well, I'm next.
Yeah.
And Saladin says, look, kings don't kill each other. And obviously makes him feel more assured. What they do, though, is they get their Sufis, their teachers, and other religious fanatics to kill all of the Templars and Hospitallers who are remaining as well. They're executed.
I think there's been a pressure for, in a sense, holy war. These are, if you like, the Crusaders' religious fanatics, if you're turning it around the other way. And these men don't pay ransoms. Maybe the leader will. They're not going to convert to Islam, and so that is really, in a sense, what are you going to do with them otherwise? But in a sense, they've driven the holy war. And while we think of Saladin as a man of mercy, we think of when he captures Jerusalem in a couple of months' time, he ransoms the population rather than slaughtering them, as the Crusaders had slaughtered the Muslims in 1099. So he has this great reputation for mercy. But here, in these particular circumstances, it is, in a sense, the pressure is on to if you like, punish the military orders, and that's what he does.
And it's very symbolic. He gets religious teachers and the Sufis and imams to do it. And of course, they're not very expert, these chaps. They're not warriors, so it's not a nasty. It's quite a nasty spectacle. The really interesting thing about it is that he's thinking immediately about what do we do now. Now, the merciful approach, which Saladin is known for, means that the result of the battle is nearly 52 castles and cities in the next few weeks and months actually surrender. Now, we shouldn't forget that the army that has gone to Hattin has significantly stripped those fortresses of quite a lot of the troops, particularly those held by the military orders. So they're not in a position to defend anyway. And the one that holds out. In fact, there are two that hold out. One is Jerusalem, that holds out till October, so quite a long time before it's negotiated. And in fact, you get Tyre holding out as well, with the arrival of a chap called Conrad of Montferrat. He's able to actually intervene and say, well, I'm actually holding Tyre. And then the scene is set for the Third Crusade.
Well, there we go. That's at least part of what really happened during the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, well, let's ask ourselves some really big questions now. Could the Battle of Hattin played out differently? Jonathan, to start with you, I suppose the key question for the Crusaders is, what if they don't go for Tiberias?
Saladin is frustrated. His carefully conceived plan is not working. There's a point at which he's aware that he cannot keep this army that he is really sort of fired up with the sort of the pre-match talk and things like that. He has to try and provoke a battle. I think he would have certainly moved further into. He would have taken Tiberias and then moved further into the kingdom, running along this valley here. Whether he would have been able to draw the Franks out at Saphoria, bearing in mind again, you know, they are susceptible to pressure, as Cresson showed. Whether he could have applied the pressure just more directly by confronting them much more, you know, physically proximate way, is conceivable, or else moved towards trying to maybe besiege somewhere on the coast. He'd besieged Beirut briefly in 1182 and used a bit of his navy as well. We don't think that was happening this time. So there are some options open to him, but he absolutely had to keep trying.
But I suppose if you were the Crusaders, you would far rather have an engagement at Acre maybe, or Saphoria, rather than the Horns of Hattin.
Because you're pulling out his supply lines. Here, Hattin works because he can bring up water from Lake Tiberias really easily. So his supply lines are not stretched in the slightest. They're sort of fully operational. The further you can draw him in, the less comfortable he's going to be. And if he starts besieging somewhere again, he's got that problem. So they are aware of his kind of limitations, if you see what I like. But they're also aware that he has got a very, very large army, and his capability of causing damage to the kingdom, economic damage, if you like, psychological damage, maybe attacking somewhere like Nazareth, is at its highest.
Chris, once the Crusaders decide they're going to try and relieve Tiberias, is the battle lost at that point? Was that the key error, or could they have done something to improve their chances?
Well, I think just going on from Jonathan's point, I think if Saladin doesn't succeed in drawing them on, at this point, knowing he's got a very large force, he can afford to split his forces and try and split the crusading army. Feint towards Acre, feint to Nazareth, as Jonathan says. So that's a possibility, and that's something the crusading army would have been wanting to guard against, because they wouldn't have wanted to split themselves. So you actually give them a real problem if you split at this point. Again, supplies are the issue. How much can you actually penetrate here? My own view is that I think that in these circumstances, the stakes were so high that he would have had to come on to Saphoria and take on the Christians where they were, if only to give them a holding action. It's well defended, it's well watered. He may think he won't win, but as I said, with a bit of a deception as well, perhaps going around here, that's the case. I think as soon as you commit to the second day, oddly enough, I think that's when the battle's over. If there'd been the ability to fight their way back to Saphoria and say, right, OK, we got that wrong, we need to go back. But I think all the pressure of honour, the ability to take on this army that's appeared on our side of the fence for once. We've got the biggest army we've had in some time. I think the pressure is enormous, and all the personality issues going on in the medieval mind. I think we have to remember these people are rational but not reasonable by our standards in the way they think about these things.
I'm not sure I quite agree with that, but
I think it's according to their own lights. You know, they're all coming at it from their own psychological disposition and background.
Yeah, but I think honour is absolutely a big part of it, and the political pressures, but also the military pressures, realising that this man is at his most dangerous now.
And if we don't defeat him now, he's going to come back.
Yes, he will.
And that's the other problem.
I mean, OK, he may not be able to come back immediately because he's made this big fanfare. I think there would be, and I think this is an important, a reputational hit, which he is well aware of, that if he didn't succeed in making some significant progress this time. You know, you've been fighting Muslims for a long time. You say this is all about recovering Jerusalem. You know, you've got everybody together and you haven't delivered.
Yes.
That is what's at the back of his... And his advisors are saying this openly to him. You know, we can see this in the sources. So, you know, he knows that something has to happen. OK, if he'd have had a very sort of successful raid, maybe captured Tiberias, well, OK, he could have come back in a year or two's time. But I think the longer you leave that kind of like unfulfilled promise...
There was a time pressure on him.
Your credibility is beginning to weaken, I think.
Well, talking of time, I mean, obviously the fact that this battle happens in the height of summer, right at the start of July, that makes it incredibly difficult for the Crusader forces. Incredibly arid landscape, as we've discussed. If the battle had happened a few months later, would that fundamentally have changed things?
Very possibly. I mean, some of the other battles do take place at other parts of the year. I mean, some of the ones up in the north take place in October, and you don't have the same pressures. There's no question about that. I mean, you're in the middle of the campaigning season as far as a lot of these sort of people are concerned. But I think the key issue here is why it is that you choose to go on to the second day. OK, you're actually going further into the bag, if you like, and you're being caught. Now, at no stage have I seen any consideration of going back and actually saying, we've blown this.
I think it's because, in part, they've gone further than halfway. If it's about 30 kilometres, they've gone sort of just over 20. So, in a sense, you know, and you haven't... Yeah, you can, you know, it's glittering in the distance. Yeah. And so you sort of psychologically, I think, there is that kind of forward pressure. I think you know, maybe it's quite a hard thing to turn around and go back. But again, they are being blocked from behind as well. They're going to have to fight their way back, if you see what I mean. I think, for my money, Chris, actually setting out in the first place is
there's no question.
Just,
but I think it was recoverable. That was the point.
Yeah.
And also, it's quite difficult. If you are a retreating army, it's actually quite difficult if you're being pursued as well. It's a question of whether Saladin had the capacity to actually get all his forces to pursue them. But, you know, the way that the Crusaders operated, as I said, they had a pretty pre-prepared doctrine about doing this. And if they knew they were going... I mean, the key thing that I don't understand, Jonathan, is why Saladin didn't go back and capture Sepharia. Actually get back and actually say, well, you're not coming back anyway, because that's what I would have done, is said, right, you know, even if you think you're going back, I've actually got my forces there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he could have, he in a sense, could have split his forces and sent them around there to block that, had that eventuality taken place. But I think he's just shepherding them down the valley.
I mean, the key thing is the Crusading army is diverted off the path that they were going to take.
Yes.
Although it's still all very dry, you know, we're not. It's not a better option in that sense.
So, in summary, I suppose we can say Raymond of Tripoli was right.
Yeah.
And Guy of Lusignan made a fundamental error.
Yes.
There we go. So that's how the Battle of Hattin maybe could have played out differently. Let's zoom out now and ask ourselves, if it had played out differently, what might the long-term historical consequences have been? OK, we're zooming out again now. We're focusing on the wider situation in the Levant. And I suppose a key question for you, Jonathan, to kick things off is, OK, if Hattin plays out differently, if Saladin doesn't win the Battle of Hattin, therefore does Jerusalem fall a few months later?
No, I don't think so. Jerusalem is a difficult defensive site. First Crusade struggled to get into it. Saladin took a few weeks to get into it, even after Hattin. So I think his ability to besiege it would have been, you know, pretty marginal. I just don't think he would have risked it. So no, I don't think Jerusalem would have fallen at all.
Chris, do you agree?
Absolutely, and I think if the battle had gone the other way, you'd have seen all the fortresses refortified. I think you'd have seen the Crusading kingdom saying, OK, we've managed to repel that. What can we learn from that? And see how we do it better next time. I think, as Jonathan hinted earlier on, the coalition would have fallen apart at that point. I think you'd have had trouble in Egypt, to tell you the truth, because his rule there up to that point was never, ever as secure as it might be. And the Crusading kingdom itself had a habit of interfering in Egypt. So there might have been some pressure later on in that region. I suspect, given what he put in place, that most of his power would have been centred on Damascus. after this, because he then possibly would have thought that in the wake of a Christian victory, Damascus itself might be vulnerable, as it had been during the Second Crusade in the 1140s.
If he'd been really heavily defeated in 1187, potentially so. But Damascus is a very strong site, and Saladin does have Aleppo and Mosul. Aleppo is much more firmly under his control by this time. So I think let's not underestimate the resources that he's got. And Egypt really is so wealthy. It really is if you have that, you've got the finance to keep armies going. You've got a bit of a fleet as well there too. So I think he would still have remained strong. But yes, he has got this confederation that he's got to try and keep people together. He's got to keep his own family happy, his supporters, the family of Nur al-Din, who he usurped. So yeah, there's a lot of pressure on him. And of course, we've got to remember the wider picture beyond this map, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
There's the Seljuk Turks, there's the Caliph of Baghdad, the Armenians, the Georgians, and so it's a complicated picture, all of whom, are taking an interest in what's going on here.
So what if Saladin is killed at Hattin?
Crucial question, yes.
That's the issue. And as Jonathan well knows, I mean, Saladin has 17 sons, is it?
Yes, he does.
Yeah, and so you've got a real dynastic problem coming there. We know from the history of this region that sons tend to fight it out rather than actually sort of come together. So if Saladin is killed, this is absolutely critical at this point. The coalition probably falls apart. You've got his sons fighting amongst each other for the spoils. And the Crusading kingdoms become more resilient as a result.
I think, his sons, a lot of them are pretty young at this stage, given there's so many of them. I think the figure who could have come through is maybe the man we know as Saladin, which is his brother, who he relies on. It's interesting, you can see him almost relying on this as his sort of best friend as well. He turns to Saladin for advice a lot of the time. And when, after Saladin dies in 1193, yes, some of the sons do start scrapping. In the end, Uncle Saladin steps in and sort of goes, OK, I'm the grown-up. We need to settle things down, and he very much sort of asserts authority. So there is potentially a figure there around it. But, as you say, killing Saladin, he is, this Ayyubid family, as they're called, he is their front man. They are most of the time incredibly loyal to him. You think of families in the West, Henry II of England, the rebellions against him from his children and his wife. Saladin's Ayyubid family realise that he is a great leader, and so they stick pretty strongly with him. But if he's killed, then that's a different scene.
And presumably Saladin coming to the fore in 1187 as opposed to 1193 over a weaker coalition, if they have been defeated at Hattin, is a very different state of affairs.
Yeah. I mean, Saladin has got sort of Egypt as a base, so he's got good money behind him. But I think psychologically the damage would have been significant to the whole Ayyubid confederation.
And it may well be that was in the back of the minds of some of the Christian leaders as well. If we smash him here, we kill him here, OK, it all goes away for a while.
Here's a really big question. Jerusalem hasn't fallen because the Battle of Hattin has played out differently. Therefore, does the Third Crusade begin in 1189?
No, it doesn't. Not in the way we think it would. There would be no incentive for Philip of France to actually go. Frederick Barbarossa wouldn't be incentivised to do so. Richard I, I think Jonathan and I could debate about this. I mean, he's the David Beckham of the time. He's a noted war leader. He's very good at war. His father has promised that he would go on crusade. Does he inherit that sort of promise? Henry has already sent money out, which Gerard of Rietford, by the way, has already spent ahead of the Battle of Hattin on bringing in troops and mercenaries. So there may well have been Richard coming out, if you like, and playing an away game here.
You think he's spoiling for a fight, and he?
I think he's looking to go on crusade because he wants to prove himself further in a bigger field. Going to the Holy Land has a lot of spiritual but also professional sort of credits if you go there. So Richard may well have come, but my hunch is there would have been no pressure actually for anybody to come from Europe at this stage if Hattin hadn't happened. You see the massive outpouring of grief and also looking for funds afterwards. The whole of Gerald of Wales, its trip around Wales, is actually founded on people taking the cross and getting resources for building a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. It's hugely totemic. So if that's not lost, you're not going to have that draw to come out to the east to do that. So I think the Third Crusade doesn't happen. So the whole balance of forces, political forces in Europe changes. Richard, for example, is maybe more engaged with Philip of France. Dare I say it, England doesn't lose its various duchies and counties in France. Normandy is not lost as it was under King John.
Well, that's a very interesting scenario. Jonathan, let's bring you in on the Third Crusade. Do you agree with Chris that the Third Crusade doesn't happen, or certainly doesn't happen when it does?
Absolutely doesn't happen. I mean, the fall of Jerusalem causes the Pope allegedly to die of a heart attack. The shock, the core, the heart of the Christian faith has been taken. And Saladin is seen at that time as the son of Satan. He's an incredibly sort of diabolical figure. But the mourning, that's the word that keeps coming up in the text, mourning for this loss of the Holy City. It's a profound shock. And so, in a sense, there's a Christian obligation to go out and recover it. There's also, we've been talking about honour. In a sense, kings have got to go and do their bit. So the main rulers of Europe are pretty well obliged to go out. I think they would have wanted to as well anyway. And so, no, I don't think you have the Third Crusade as, that trigger is not there. Whether, as you say, Richard would have been interested in it, yes, he's a warrior. He's conventionally pious, I think we'll call him that. But he's also somebody who very much likes honour and display. And if he could have prepared a crusade properly, because, well, we think of Richard as this kind of rather headstrong warrior, I think that's not entirely right. He's good at preparation. He likes logistics. He's quite cautious in all that way. There are still going to be calls for help from the Holy Land. OK, maybe if Jerusalem hadn't fallen, this Saladin is still dangerous. And so there is a need, perhaps, for a new crusade, as they'd asked in 1185 with the Patriarch coming to London. So he could well have responded to that. I don't think that's a ridiculous suggestion.
I mean, the key thing about Hattin is that the Crusading kingdom is no longer capable of offensive action after that.
It's not capable of defensive action.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, after the Third Crusade, it ends up with this narrow coastal strip from Jaffa up to Beirut. That's about it.
Yeah.
And it needs constant reinforcement in the future in terms of resources and manpower, even to survive. And up till the 1240s, it just about hangs on. But the key point is it's never able to do that. My point is that if Hattin is won, and Saladin may be killed or defeated badly, it means that the offensive capacity for the Crusading kingdoms is retained.
And potentially they expand their territory further. You mentioned Damascus, maybe. Well,
maybe, but actually, I mean, where they've been very interested in the past and where future crusades actually look at is Egypt itself. The resources, as Jonathan says, are huge there. Under Aymery I, a previous king in the 12th century, he'd been very engaged in Egypt and saying, our security is absolutely based on what we can get in Egypt. If we can keep Egypt and its resources on side, then we're secure. And Saladin knew that. And of course, he bent it to his use as well. So I suspect the Crusading kingdoms would have actually looked south in those circumstances for those resources. And I think the Byzantines would have been involved again, as they were under Aymery I, to try and exploit what was going on in Egypt.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. I think what we can certainly say is that, yes, the Battle of Hattin almost certainly could have played out differently. Probably the crucial moment was when Guy of Lusignan decided, yes, we are going to try and relieve Tiberius, despite the fact that Raymond of Tripoli, whose wife was besieged there, said, no, we should not be doing that. Had they engaged somewhere else other than the Horns of Hattin, had they met Saladin's forces, let's say, nearer to Sepharia, then potentially it could have played out very differently and it would not have been a decisive victory for Saladin. You could even have a scenario in which Saladin is killed at the Horns of Hattin or the Battle of Hattin or the engagement that takes place around that time in 1187. If that happens, does Saladin rise to power earlier? But he's got a far weaker coalition of Muslim forces at the time. Crucially, if Hattin is not lost by the Crusaders, does Jerusalem fall in October of 1187? Almost certainly not. If it doesn't, there isn't the need for the Third Crusade that begins in 1187. Richard the Lionheart has become a legendary figure in British history, therefore maybe has a far smaller role in the history books. And of course, maybe we don't know so much about Saladin as well. And if Richard the Lionheart isn't going off on a Third Crusade, what then happens to the English territories in France? Some really big long-term consequences, all stemming from the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Well, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. My thanks to Jonathan and Chris for joining me, and we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show and follow wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.